My family moved around a lot when I was younger, spending only a year here and there until eventually settling for a time in Louisiana. Our first move from small town, middle class DeKalb, Illinois, to the diverse megalopolis of Dallas, Texas, shocked my 8th grade system. Instead of a handful of people who all knew each other and had gone mainly to the same schools together since kindergarten, I was suddenly surrounded by a couple of thousand 6th, 7th, and 8th graders. Strangers were crowded into a big, noisy, cement block box. It felt a lot more like a warehouse than a school. Now, I was an outgoing kid, but I was overwhelmed. It was hard to make friends. The band geeks didn't really like me because I was new, and my audition had put me first chair in the percussion section, displacing pretty much all of them. Also, a Jewish mom and a Catholic dad meant that I wasn't Jewish enough for the Jewish kids, or Catholic enough for the Catholics. And really, I wasn't all that interested in religion back then anyway. I had other problems, like being lost in Babylon. Fortunately, I was terrible at math, which landed me in an after-school program with other kids who were also terrible at math. Now, being bad at something is a great equalizer. It's really different from being good at something. When we're good at a skill, we become competitive and we want to be, the best. But it humbles us. And it forces us to admit we need to learn and practice when we're bad at something. So, for the entire school year, which was the extent of our time in Dallas, I sat at a little table with a bunch of folks who were also bad at math, and I made friends with all of these displaced kids from all over the world. And they introduced me to all sorts of interesting things like salsa music, which spoke to my soul from the first timbali-infused blast. Dallas was my introduction to cultural relativism, the idea that we can only understand a person's beliefs and thoughts in the context of their culture. Cultural relativism, again, is the idea that we can only understand a person's beliefs and thoughts in the context of their culture. We can't compare someone else's way of being to ours because there is no normal behavior, despite what white Western Europeans have tried to convince the rest of the world. I didn't know this at the time, of course. Back then, I was just a terrified 13-year-old, entirely out of his comfort zone. The school was, loud all the time because some wiseacre thought it was a good idea to throw 1,000 kids into a big room and teach them 100 different things simultaneously, as if the cacophony wouldn't be a distraction. The chaos helped me grow, though. I began to understand that people treated each other very differently based on the most specious and nominal of concepts. Skin color, of course. Religion was a big one in Dallas. Perceived intelligence, perceived, not real intelligence. Hipness, and a bunch of other arcane ideas that really have nothing to do with a person's actual being. This results in the creation of outrageous cliques, and there was a caste system there that I had never before experienced. Mainly because I was the caste system. I am the caste system. Through our subsequent moves to Austin, Lake Charles, and Salt Lake City, I carried those lessons from Dallas with me. And now I understand that time as the beginning of an awakening, an expanded awareness of the world and how we treat people. Eventually, an appreciation for the diversity of human culture became central to my being, driving me to travel and explore, to try new languages, new music, new foods, new literature, to listen to new ideas, and to think about different ways of experiencing being human. I think mainly because my mom always invited people over to eat everywhere that we moved, I learned also that music and food are universal languages and a terrific way to create community. Breaking bread with strangers is an astoundingly effective and fun way to break down barriers and turn those strangers into friends. Travel. Even reading the stories about Jesus' travels, reading contemporary travelogues, or watching the Travel Channel. All of that helps us understand that we must never ignore cultural context. What's acceptable in one culture may be heinous in another. What's taken for granted in the United States may be seen as a luxury in Laos. A standard greeting like waving hello is an insult in Greece. Seriously. The towns or cities in which we were raised, the financial condition of our family, the cultural diversity of our friends and neighbors. Whether we grew up in block housing in Brooklyn, a mansion in Mumbai, or a salmon farm in Nova Scotia, affects the way that we comprehend and react to the rest of the world. We need to be aware of our cultural biases and make sure we're not imprinting them on cultures that do things differently. When I moved at 13, my only context was 1970s white male, middle-class, Midwest suburbia. Dallas expanded my mind and understanding of the world. And while I still had no idea just how much privilege being a white male afforded me then, I think my experiences made it easier for me to say, yep, I have been afforded great opportunities simply because I'm a white guy, when that awareness was brought to my attention. And it's a pity I had to learn that. And learning still I am. The tendency to make everyone look and act like us is not new. It was a problem even when Jesus was teaching about a worldview that unites God's diverse people. Rome was trying to remake the world in its image when Paul traipsed all over Asia Minor, spreading his gospel of a new world made in God's image. For Jesus, for Paul, and the apostles, every city was a little different, and they learned to adjust their delivery to fit the cultural context. Paul speaks an aristocratic and academic Greek at the Areopagus, and he probably spoke conversational Hebrew, maybe even Aramaic to the Jewish crowds. And while all the cities they visited were part of the Roman Empire, each had its own ideas about local government, gods, level of education, and acceptable cultural norms, including relationships between men and women, indentured servitude, upward mobility, church and the state, etc., etc. What played in Corinth definitely did not play in Nazareth. Cultural biases and assumptions often get in the way of our ability to learn from one another. We all have prejudices causing us to see people with different cultural identities as foreigners, even when they often speak the same language and believe many of the same things as we. Prejudice blocks progress. Paul had to face cultural presuppositions when he traveled around the empire, and he overcame them by genuinely meeting people where they were. Paul was well-traveled and well-educated, so he knew, at least well enough, the particular idiosyncrasies of the places he visited. And when speaking to Greeks, he uses philosophy and reason to explain his ideas about Jesus. And when speaking to Jews, he shows them how Jesus' teachings are directly drawn from the Torah. Like Jesus, Paul unites people from all walks of life. Gentiles, Jews, enslaved people, free people, men, women, all of them equally are welcome into a unique community with a new cultural identity. That new cultural identity part, it's essential because people from all walks of life, aristocrats, tradespeople, even prostitutes and tax collectors, were all hanging out in the same place, worshiping a new God, proclaiming everyone is loved equally, no matter who they are, what their job is, or where they come from. In an intensely stratified society like ancient Rome, that would have been scandalous, folks. Over time, Paul's churches develop communal rituals and words that help connect these daring spiritual speakers beyond their individual languages and traditions. Over the millennia, those words have taken on new meanings and new pronunciations, creating a vibrant, living faith practiced in a multitude of creative ways worldwide. Paul never intends for us to leave our cultures at the door. On the contrary, he wants us to celebrate the rich manifestation of God's creativity in every human being, in every ethnicity. Paul works diligently to remove barriers for entry into a God experience. This is why he doesn't require circumcision or food laws for new converts to the Jesus movement. He welcomes everybody into a community that celebrates the authenticity of their God experience within the community. As he writes in 1 Corinthians 12, "Now there are varieties of gifts, but the same Spirit. And there are varieties of services, but the same Lord. And there are varieties of activities, but it is the same God who activates all of them in everyone. To each is given the manifestation of the Spirit for the common good. To one is given through the Spirit the utterance of wisdom, and to another the utterance of knowledge, according to the same Spirit. To another, faith by the same Spirit. To another, gifts of healing by the one Spirit. To another, the working of miracles. To another, prophecy. To another, the discernment of spirits. To another, various kinds of tongues. And to another, the interpretation of tongues. All these are activated by one and the same Spirit, who allots to each one individually just as the Spirit chooses. I think this is possibly the most excellent love letter to diversity ever written. Everything comes from the same Spirit, and all of it is magnificent, Paul says. All of it. He goes on to insist that the church is where this dream becomes a reality. Paul had difficulty getting people to buy into his vision of a spiritually based cultural context that integrates individual experience. I mean, he ends up spending a great deal of his time writing corrective letters to the churches because they keep falling back into old human patterns of patriarchal dominance. But Paul and Jesus both imagine a much more communal and egalitarian community. Today, our always-on media too often exacerbate our perceived differences. But the internet also provides an incredible opportunity to ignite a profound appreciation for the mind-boggling variety and individuality of civilizations worldwide. And that appreciation of diversity is essential because living together in Paul's transcendent space, being Jesus's hands and feet, even acting as merely decent human beings, requires us to accept, acknowledge, and appreciate every human and their culture for the God-bearing blessing it is. Amen. Our question today is, which cultural context other than your own has most contributed to your spiritual journey, and why? Which cultural context outside of yours has most contributed to your spiritual journey, and why? We'll be in breakout rooms for about 10 minutes or so, and then we'll come back and discuss our ideas with one another.